The theater lights dimmed with the soft impatience of an audience that had already seen too much and was hungry for something real. The judges leaned back in their chairs with the practiced calm of people who had learned how to hide surprise behind raised eyebrows and folded arms. Somewhere backstage, a man stood alone, his palms open and empty, breathing in the quiet like it was a promise. He was Filipino, middle-aged, with a face shaped by years of sun and work, and a voice he had kept mostly to himself. He had sung in kitchens and garages, at birthdays and wakes, at the end of long shifts when the world felt smaller and kinder. Tonight, he was about to sing Elvis, and nobody, least of all Simon, was prepared for what would happen next. When his name was called, he walked out with careful steps, not rushed, not slow, like someone crossing a familiar room in the dark. The crowd gave him a polite ripple of applause, the kind that didn't mean much yet. He smiled, a shy curve that softened his eyes, and nodded to the judges. His clothes were simple, clean, chosen for comfort rather than effect. He looked like someone you might pass on the street and forget within minutes, and that was exactly why the room leaned forward a little, curious in spite of itself. Simon glanced down at the card, then back up, already measuring expectations. Elvis, he thought, was dangerous territory. Too many people tried to imitate the swagger without earning it, to borrow the shine without carrying the weight. Elvis songs came with ghosts and comparisons, with the memory of a voice that had once filled arenas and radios and dreams. The safest route would have been something obscure, something personal. But this man had chosen the king. The music began softly, a familiar progression that made a few heads tilt. There was a split second where the air held its breath. Then he sang. It wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't even immediately impressive in the way television talent often demanded. It was honest. The tone came out warm and steady, like a hand placed gently on your shoulder. There was a subtle gravel underneath, earned rather than affected, and it carried the melody with care. He didn't rush the notes. He didn't chase applause. He let the song unfold as if it had been waiting for him. The audience shifted. A few people exchanged looks. Someone laughed quietly, not in mockery, but in surprise, like they'd just found something precious in an unexpected place. The man on stage closed his eyes for a moment, not to hide, but to listen to himself, to stay inside the song. His shoulders relaxed. His breath deepened. He was no longer thinking about cameras or judges or the millions who might watch later. He was back in a small room somewhere, singing because he needed to. Simon straightened in his chair. There was something about the phrasing that felt lived in. He didn't mimic Elvis's famous bends and flourishes. Instead, he respected them, touched them lightly, and then let his own story fill the gaps. The vowels carried a hint of his roots, not enough to distract, just enough to remind everyone that this voice had traveled a long way to be here. It was Elvis seen through another life, another set of memories, another map of joys and disappointments. As the song built, the room warmed. People leaned forward without realizing it. Phones that had been raised half-heartedly were now held steady, as if afraid to miss a moment. A woman in the audience wiped her eyes and laughed at herself. A man nodded slowly, keeping time. The band, sensing something special, played with restraint, giving the voice space to breathe. Simon watched closely, his skepticism dissolving into focus. He had seen raw talent before, and he had seen trained excellence. What he was hearing now sat somewhere in between, a place that couldn't be manufactured. It was the sound of someone who had sung through hardship, who had learned patience from waiting, who understood that emotion wasn't something you added at the end, but something you carried from the start. The singer reached the chorus and didn't push. He trusted the melody. The power came not from volume, but from control, from the way he held a note just a fraction longer than expected, then let it fall like a sigh. The audience responded instinctively, a murmur of appreciation rippling through the seats. This wasn't just nostalgia. This was connection. As the song continued, images seemed to gather around him, invisible but felt. Late nights after double shifts. Long bus rides with cheap headphones. A childhood where music played on the radio while adults talked about bills and weather and hope. The Philippines was an ocean away, but it lived in his cadence, in the way he shaped emotion without dramatics. He wasn't trying to be Elvis. He was letting Elvis meet him halfway. When the final note faded, there was a beat of silence, the kind that only happens when a room needs a second to catch up to its own feelings. Then the applause broke out, not explosive, but deep and sustained, like a wave that had found its rhythm. People stood without prompting. Cheers rose, surprised by their own volume. The singer opened his eyes and smiled again, wider this time, a mix of relief and disbelief. He bowed slightly, hands clasped, as if thanking the song itself. He looked toward the judges, waiting. Simon shook his head slowly, a small smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "I did not see that coming," he said, leaning into the microphone. The crowd laughed, knowing exactly what he meant. Elvis is one of the hardest artists to do. Most people come out and do an impression. What you did, you made it yours. That was brave. And it was good. The singer nodded, swallowing, eyes shining. Another judge spoke about authenticity, about how the performance felt like a conversation rather than a show. A third mentioned the warmth in his tone, the way it wrapped around the room. Each comment landed gently, affirming without overwhelming. Through it all, the man on stage stood still, listening like someone who didn't take praise for granted. Simon looked at him again, this time with curiosity rather than assessment. "Why Elvis?" he asked. The answer came simply. He talked about his father's old records, about hearing that voice for the first time and feeling less alone. He talked about singing along without understanding all the words, but understanding the feeling. He talked about carrying those songs with him as he moved through different jobs, different countries, different versions of himself. As he spoke, the audience leaned in once more, recognizing the universal in the specific. Everyone had a song like that, a voice that had kept them company when they needed it most. The vote was a formality. Yes came easily, warmly, and when the final one landed, the cheers returned, louder now, celebratory. The singer covered his face for a moment, overwhelmed, then laughed, a sound that felt like release. He walked off stage to applause that followed him like a blessing. Backstage, he leaned against a wall and breathed. Someone handed him water. Someone else clapped him on the back. The noise of the theater felt distant, muffled, like waves heard from underwater. He thought about calling home, about telling his family that he had done it, that he had sung Elvis and survived, that for a few minutes, the world had listened. Later, when clips of the performance spread online, comments poured in from everywhere. People wrote about being surprised, about feeling something they hadn't expected. Filipinos shared pride and recognition, seeing a piece of themselves in his success. Elvis fans debated and smiled, agreeing that the king would have approved. Some viewers watched it late at night, alone, replaying the moment where the voice settled into their chest and stayed there. Simon watched it again too, in a quiet moment between meetings. Without the lights and the crowd, it still worked. That, he knew, was the test. Great performances didn't depend on spectacle. They traveled well. They lingered. They reminded you why you started listening in the first place. For the singer, life didn't transform overnight into something unreal. There were still rehearsals, still nerves, still the long road ahead. But something had shifted. A door had opened, not just in the competition, but inside him. He had trusted his voice on a big stage and been met with kindness rather than judgment. That mattered more than any headline. In interviews, he spoke softly, always redirecting attention back to music, back to gratitude. He talked about Elvis as a bridge, about honoring influences while telling your own story. He talked about dreaming without demanding, about taking chances even when you don't fit the picture people expect. And when he sang again, whether it was Elvis or something else entirely, people listened differently. They listened for the person behind the notes, for the life woven into the sound. They listened because they had learned, in one surprising audition, that magic didn't always arrive dressed in confidence and fireworks. Sometimes it walked out quietly, smiled, and sang a song you thought you already knew, until you realized you were hearing it for the first time. Long after the season ended, that performance remained one of those moments fans talked about, the kind you send to friends with a simple message, "Trust me. Watch this." It became shorthand for the joy of being wrong, for the thrill of discovering depth where you hadn't expected it. It reminded people that music was bigger than borders, that a voice could carry history and hope across oceans and land in a theater, ready to be shared. For the man who had sung Elvis that night, the memory stayed close. Whenever doubt crept in, he remembered the hush before the first note, the way the room had opened to him, the look on Simon's face when skepticism turned into respect. He remembered that courage didn't always roar. Sometimes it sang, steady and warm, and trusted that someone would hear it.